Get that welder out of my drill space, grease monkey. This is an active security simulation, not a scrapyard. Are you deaf? The voice, sharp and laced with the unearned confidence of a new uniform, cut through the low thrum of the UNS Legacy's main hangar bay. Lieutenant Marcus Thorne, barely a year out of the academy and radiating an almost comical level of self-importance, stood with his hands on his hips, his polished boots gleaming under the harsh industrial lights. The crowd of security cadets, all young and eager to impress, snickered. They formed a semicircle, a captive audience for their instructor's casual cruelty. The target of his scorn didn't flinch. Petty Officer Anya Sharma, her small frame lost in grease-stained gray coveralls, remained crouched over a hairline fracture in a deck plate, her plasma torch held with the stillness of a surgeon's scalpel. She was finishing a micro-weld, a task requiring absolute precision, and the universe outside, that glowing bead of molten metal, simply ceased to exist for her. Silence was her native tongue. The hiss of argon gas and the hum of a magnetic clamp were the only reply she ever seemed to offer. Thorne's face tightened, a vein pulsing in his temple. He despised being ignored, especially by someone he considered so far beneath him. He strode forward, his footsteps echoing with manufactured authority. "I'm talking to you," he snapped, kicking the portable power cell that fed her torch. The beam flickered and died. Still, she did not look up. Instead, her gloved hand moved with methodical grace, securing the cooling nozzle and placing the tool carefully on a magnetized tray. Only then did she rise, turning to face him. Her face, smudged with carbon scoring, was impassive. Her eyes, a dark and unreadable brown, held no anger, no fear, no reaction at all. They simply registered his presence. This utter lack of deference was more infuriating to Thorne than any shouted retort could ever be. He was an officer. She was enlisted. The hierarchy was as fundamental as gravity, yet she looked at him as if he were just a minor atmospheric disturbance. "We are running a Class 4 breach simulation," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He gestured to his cadets, who were now holding kinetic pulse shotguns, the standard issue for repelling boarders. "This requires focus. It requires discipline, something a common shipwright wouldn't understand. Now, take your junk and clear out." He paused, waiting for the apology, the scramble to comply. He received only calm, patient silence. This was the moment that would define him in the eyes of his trainees. He needed to assert dominance. He snatched one of the training shotguns from a nervous-looking cadet. The weapon was heavy, designed to feel like its lethal counterpart, though it fired a focused percussive blast that could shatter a composite door but would only bruise a person. He advanced on Sharma until the barrel was inches from her face. "Do you understand the chain of command?" he whispered, the sound of venomous hiss in the suddenly quiet hangar. The cadets shuffled their feet, the humor of the situation curdling into something uncomfortable. When she still didn't speak, just watched him with those unervingly steady eyes, he did the unthinkable. He pressed the cold, circular muzzle of the shotgun against her forehead, right between her eyes. "I said," he enunciated slowly, as if to a child, "get out." The crowd gasped. A line had been crossed, but the Admiral, standing on the observation deck high above, saw none of it. She only saw the stance of the small woman in the gray coveralls, a stance she hadn't seen in a decade, a stance that made the blood run cold in her veins. If you believe that true strength is measured not in volume, but in quiet competence, type respect below. The cold metal of the shotgun's muzzle against her skin was a simple fact, a data point to be processed. It was not an insult. It was not a threat. It was a physical object exerting pressure on her forehead. Petty Officer Sharma's heart rate did not increase. Her breathing remained a slow, steady rhythm, the same rhythm she used to time the pulse of her plasma torch, the same rhythm she used to stitch together the broken bones of starships. Lieutenant Thorne's face was a canvas of rage and insecurity, his eyes wide, his lips pulled back in a sneer. He was a storm in a bottle, loud and contained, and ultimately harmless to the mountain. She could feel the slight tremor in his hands as he held the weapon, a vibration of adrenaline and uncertainty. He needed this, she realized. He needed her to be afraid. He needed her to shrink, to apologize, to validate his fragile authority with her submission. Her continued silence was a denial of that validation, a mirror reflecting his own inadequacy back at him. It was, in its own way, the cruelest response she could have possibly given. The hangar bay had fallen into a tomb-like quiet, the background hum of the ship's life support systems suddenly deafening. The cadets were frozen, their initial amusement replaced by a growing sense of dread. They were witnessing not a lesson in discipline, but a profound abuse of power, and they knew it. The performance was, for them, a demonstration of their instructor's supposed iron will, but it was failing spectacularly. The longer Sharma stood there, a living statue of composure, the more foolish and unhinged Thorn appeared. His authority was not being cemented. It was dissolving in real time, corroding under the acid of her professional calm. He was a man shouting at the tide, and the tide was not listening. "This is your final warning, petty officer," Thorn ground out, his voice low and shaky. He was losing control of the narrative. He had expected tears, or pleading, or at the very least a panicked scramble. He had received nothing. He was left standing there, holding a weapon to the head of an unarmed woman who seemed more bored than intimidated. It was pathetic. Finally, Sharma moved. It was not a flinch or a retreat. With a slow, deliberate motion, she raised her left hand. She didn't push the weapon away. Instead, her thumb and forefinger, calloused and sure, gently clasped the barrel and moved it a single inch to the right, away from the center of her forehead. Her eyes never left his. Then she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried through the cavernous space with the clarity of a bell. "Your stance is unbalanced, Lieutenant. Your left foot is half an inch too far back. If you were to fire a live round, the recoil would send you stumbling. Your cadets are mirroring your error." Her words were not an attack. They were a technical correction, delivered with the dispassionate air of an instructor pointing out a flawed weld. The sheer, unexpected professionalism of the statement struck Thorn like a physical blow. He had tried to humiliate her as a welder, and she had just critiqued his form as a soldier. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. He recoiled as if burned, pulling the shotgun back. He opened his mouth to shout, to salvage some shred of his dignity, but no words came. It was in that exact moment of stunned silence that the world ended. A deep, guttural groan echoed from the ship's core, a sound of tortured metal that vibrated up through the deck plates. The lights flickered violently, then went out, plunging the hangar into emergency red lighting. A klaxon began to scream, a frantic, piercing wail that signified only one thing: a catastrophic failure. On the main view screen, a schematic of the ship flashed, a pulsing crimson wound appearing in Sector Gamma 7, the engineering section directly below them. Plasma conduit rupture. Containment field failing. Hull integrity critical. The simulation was over. The real test had just begun. The sudden shift from manufactured tension to genuine crisis was a physical shockwave. The cadets, moments before complicit in Thorn's petty drama, were now just frightened kids, their faces pale and wide-eyed in the blood-red emergency lighting. The kinetic pulse shotguns they held suddenly felt like toys. Panic began to set in, a contagion of fear spreading through the hangar. One cadet dropped his weapon with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden chaos. Another was shouting, his voice thin and reedy against the deafening shriek of the alarm. Lieutenant Thorn was frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. All his academy training, all his memorized protocols had evaporated in the face of a real emergency. He stared at the flashing schematic on the view screen, his mind a blank slate. He was an officer. He was supposed to give orders, to take charge, to be the calm center of the storm. But the storm was inside him, a whirlwind of fear and inadequacy. He was a gatekeeper whose gate had just been blown off its hinges. In the midst of this rising panic, one figure remained an island of absolute calm. Petty Officer Anya Sharma had already turned away from Thorn. The personal conflict was irrelevant, a forgotten dream. Her focus was now entirely on the problem. Her movements were fluid and economical, devoid of any wasted energy. She swept her plasma torch and power cell from the floor, her hands moving with a speed and certainty that was mesmerizing. She was no longer a welder. She was a force of nature, a specialized organism responding to a critical environmental shift. She ran not to the exit, but deeper into the hangar, towards a service hatch that led down to engineering. The cadets watched her go, their fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a profound confusion. She was just a grease monkey, a low-ranking technician. Why was she running towards the danger? Thorn finally broke out of his paralysis, his training kicking in just enough for him to shout a useless order. "Seal the blast doors. Everyone to the escape pods," he yelled, his voice cracking. It was the textbook response, the one designed to save the crew by sacrificing the ship. It was also the wrong one. Sharma, hearing his command, paused at the service hatch. She turned, and for the first time, her eyes held a flicker of something other than placid observation. It was not anger, but a kind of professional disappointment. "Negative, Lieutenant," she said, her voice cutting through the klaxon's blare. "Sealing the doors will concentrate the plasma backlash. It will blow out the entire deck. We have to vent the pressure at the source." She didn't wait for his permission. She keyed a sequence into the hatch's control panel, and it hissed open, revealing a ladder descending into darkness and the hellish glow of superheated plasma. Before she disappeared into the hatch, she looked back at the stunned group. "Give me your shotgun," she said, her voice calm and even. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The cadet closest to her, the one who had dropped his weapon, simply stared at her, dumbfounded. She took 2 quick steps, scooped the weapon off the deck, checked the charge with a practiced flick of her thumb, and then looked directly at Thorn. "Keep your men here. Secure the perimeter. Wait for my signal." Without another word, she swung herself onto the ladder and descended into the fiery heart of the emergency, leaving behind a hangar full of armed security personnel under the de facto command of an unarmed shipwright. The silence she left in her wake was more profound than the alarm, a vacuum of stunned awe and dawning realization that they had just witnessed something far outside their understanding. The mountain was moving. The heat hit like a physical fist. Descending the ladder, Sharma was engulfed in a wave of air so hot it felt like inhaling razor blades. The red emergency lighting of the hangar bay gave way to the terrifying, brilliant white-blue glare of raw, uncontained plasma. The conduit in Sector Gamma 7 hadn't just ruptured. It had been sheared open, likely by a micrometeorite that had punched through the ship's outer armor. A torrent of incandescent energy, hotter than the surface of a star, was spewing from a meter-long gash in the primary coolant line, eating away at the bulkhead just inches from the ship's main fusion reactor. The noise was a physical presence, a continuous, deafening roar that vibrated through her bones. The ship's automated containment fields were flickering, trying to bottle the energy, but they were failing, overloaded by the sheer volume of the discharge. Shards of molten metal dripped from the ceiling like fiery rain. For anyone else, it was a vision of hell. For Anya Sharma, it was simply a workplace environment. This was her canvas. Her feet touched the deck of the engineering sublevel, a space now warped and glowing with heat. She moved with a purpose that bordered on preternatural, her eyes scanning, calculating, processing 1,000 variables a second. The atmospheric temperature, the decay rate of the containment field, the structural integrity of the surrounding supports, the precise frequency of the plasma stream. Her mind was a quantum computer, and the solution was already forming. She saw the fail-safe, a manual cutoff valve located on the far side of the plasma torrent. Reaching it was impossible. The raw energy would vaporize her before she got halfway. The control panel for the valve was fried, sparks showering from its melted casing. Protocol dictated that she retreat. Logic dictated that the section was lost. But Sharma did not operate on ordinary logic. She saw a different path. She propped the kinetic pulse shotgun on a stable piece of wreckage, aiming at not an enemy, but at a specific structural joint high on the ceiling. It was a calculated, impossible shot, a shot that required an intimate knowledge of the ship's architecture, of stress tolerances and ricochet angles. She didn't look through the sights. She didn't need to. She felt the angle, the trajectory, the inevitable conclusion. She squeezed the trigger. The weapon bucked, loosing a silent, shimmering blast of kinetic energy. It struck the joint perfectly, shearing a heavy titanium support beam from its mooring. The beam didn't just fall. It fell exactly as she had intended, crashing down into the plasma stream. The superheated energy, momentarily diverted, splashed against the beam, creating a momentary shield, a moving wall of metal between her and the torrent. It was a window of maybe 3 seconds. Sharma was already moving before the beam began to fall. She sprinted into the gap she had created, the impossible heat searing the fabric of her coveralls. The deck plates buckled under her feet. She wasn't just a technician. She was a combat engineer of the highest order, her body conditioned for the brutal physics of zero-G hull breaches and explosive decompressions. She moved with the grace of a dancer and the speed of an apex predator. She reached the far side of the torrent just as the titanium beam vaporized, the plasma roaring back into its original path. She hadn't just cheated death. She had redesigned the laws of physics to allow for her survival. Now, at the manual valve, she ignored the fried control panel. She unslung her plasma torch, its nozzle glowing to life. It was a tool for welding, for joining metal together. She was about to use it for the opposite. With a surgeon's precision, she used the focused beam of her torch to cut through the valve's emergency lock, a series of clean, precise incisions that bypassed the entire electronic system. Then, using the butt of the shotgun as a makeshift lever, she jammed it into the mechanism and threw her entire body weight against it. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting metal that was even louder than the plasma roar, the valve began to turn. The torrent of energy wavered, sputtered, and then, with a final, violent cough, it died. The hellish white-blue light vanished, replaced once more by the dim, steady red of the emergency lighting. The deafening roar was gone, leaving behind a ringing silence, punctuated only by the hiss of cooling metal and her own, perfectly calm breathing. She had done it. In less than 90 seconds, she had faced a ship-killing catastrophe and single-handedly neutralized it with a welder, a broken shotgun, and an impossible understanding of her environment. The silence that followed the plasma conduit shutdown was heavier and more absolute than any noise could ever be. It was the sound of a crisis averted, of a future secured. Up in the hangar bay, the screaming klaxons cut out, leaving the cadets and their disgraced lieutenant in a ringing void. On the main view screen, the pulsing crimson wound of Sector Gamma, 7 stabilized, then turned a solid, reassuring green. Containment restored. Hull integrity holding at 73%. The ship was safe. For a long moment, nobody moved. They just stared at the open hatch from which Sharma had disappeared, a dark maw that had swallowed a quiet shipwright and, somehow, spit out a miracle. They had been prepared to die, to feel the deck beneath them vaporize. Instead, they were alive, bathed in the calm, red glow of the emergency lights. It didn't make sense. Lieutenant Thorne was leaning against a bulkhead, his face ashen. The entire event had unfolded in a time frame so compressed that his mind was still struggling to catch up. He had issued a fatal order. He had frozen in the face of danger. He had been corrected and then saved by the very person he had just publicly humiliated. The foundations of his world, his training, his rank, his self-perception, had been shattered into a million pieces. He was a fraud, and her quiet competence was the undeniable proof. A slow, rhythmic clanging began to echo from the service ladder. A moment later, Sharma's head appeared, then her shoulders. She climbed out of the hatch with the same unhurried grace she had shown all along. Her coveralls were scorched, her face streaked with soot, but she was unharmed. She walked back to the center of the hangar, her footsteps the only sound. She placed the kinetic pulse shotgun on a crate, its stock slightly warped from the heat and the pressure she had exerted on it. Then she walked over to retrieve her plasma torch, wiping the nozzle clean with a practiced motion. She looked as if she had just finished a routine piece of maintenance. The cadets stared at her, their expressions a mixture of awe, confusion, and a dawning, profound respect. This was not a grease monkey. This was not a common shipwright. This was something else entirely, something they had no words for. It was then that a new sound joined the scene, the crisp, authoritative clap of magnetic boots on the deck. From the primary elevator that connected the hangar to the command bridge, two figures emerged. The first was the ship's grizzled chief engineer, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief. The second was Admiral Eva Rostova, the commander of the entire battle group, her face a mask of unreadable granite. She had seen everything from the observation deck and then on the internal security feeds. She walked past the line of frozen cadets, her eyes not even glancing at them. She walked past Lieutenant Thorne, who snapped to a pathetic attempt at attention, his body trembling. The Admiral's gaze was fixed on only one person. She stopped directly in front of Sharma, who had just finished packing her tools. The immense gulf in rank and stature was almost comical. The fleet admiral in her decorated, perfectly tailored uniform, and the soot-covered petty officer in her scorched, oversized coveralls. For a moment, they just stood there, the wise elder and the quiet professional, a silent understanding passing between them. The Admiral's eyes drifted down to the hairline fracture on the deck plate, the one Sharma had been working on before the universe had tried to end. The weld was perfect, a seamless, almost invisible line of fused metal. A work of art. Finally, the Admiral spoke, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute command. "Report, petty officer." Sharma looked up, her expression as placid as ever. Plasma conduit in Gamma 7 was compromised by a high-velocity impact. Manual cutoff was inaccessible. I improvised a solution. The reactor is stable, but the damaged bulkhead will need to be replaced. Her report was technical, precise, and devoid of any self-aggrandizement. She had improvised a solution. It was the most profound understatement the Admiral had ever heard. Admiral Rostova listened to the clipped, technical report, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of her lips. She had known, of course. From the moment she saw the stance on the observation deck, she knew. It was the Chimera stance, body perfectly balanced, center of gravity low, a posture of absolute readiness disguised as relaxed stillness. It was a ghost from her past, a ghost from a program so secret that most of the Admiralty believed it was a myth. She turned her attention to the chief engineer, who was now running frantic diagnostics on a datapad. "Chief, what's your assessment?" The chief, a man with 50 years of starship engineering under his belt, looked up, his eyes wide with a kind of religious awe. "Admiral, the damage, it should have been catastrophic. A full reactor overload. She didn't just patch a leak. The energy readings show she redirected the entire plasma stream for 28 seconds to create a temporary void. It's not theoretically possible. It defies the laws of thermodynamics." The Admiral simply nodded, as if this were an expected outcome. She then turned her gaze, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, onto Lieutenant Thorne. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice dropping a full octave, "give me your report. Explain to me the events that transpired in this hangar bay prior to the emergency." Thorne swallowed hard, his face pale. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. All his arrogance, all his bluster was gone, stripped away by the raw, undeniable truth of his own failure. He looked from the Admiral's unforgiving eyes to Sharma's impassive face, and he knew there was no escape. I made an error in judgment, Admiral," he stammered. "A grave error. An error in judgment is when you choose the wrong tactical formation, Lieutenant." The Admiral corrected him, her voice dangerously soft. "When you press a weapon to the head of a fellow member of the fleet, that is not an error. That is a disgrace. You used your rank as a weapon to humiliate someone you perceived as your lesser." The irony is that you were the lesser in this room by every conceivable metric: skill, courage, and discipline. She let the words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow to Thorn's shattered pride. Then, she held out her hand. Her service record. Now, an aide, who had followed the Admiral from the bridge, quickly handed her a datapad. The Admiral tapped the screen, her movements efficient and precise. She turned the screen so that Thorn and all the cadets could see it. It was Sharma's personnel file. Most of it was just black lines, thick blocks of redaction under headings like mission history and combat engagements, but some information was visible. Name: Anya Sharma. Rank: Petty Officer, 2nd Class. Specialization: Structural Maintenance. And then, below that, a single line of text that made the entire hangar bay hold its collective breath. Unit designation: Aegis Division. Special Projects Group. Codename: Chimera. Thorn stared at the screen, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. Aegis Division wasn't real. It was a bogeyman story told to recruits, a myth about a handful of deep space operators who handled threats that officially didn't exist. They were the ghosts of the fleet, the surgeons who were called in when a ship was already dead, performing miracles in the cold, hard vacuum of space. They were legends. Not small, quiet women who fixed deck plates. The Admiral swiped the screen, bringing up a list of commendations. Each one was more unbelievable than the last. The Titan Siege Medal, awarded for actions during the fall of Cygnus X-1. The Orion Cross for extreme valor, a medal so rare it had only been awarded 7 times, for single-handedly preventing a warp core breach on a UNS Vindicator by welding a containment vessel shut from the inside. The list went on. Mission after mission, all classified, all speaking to a level of heroism and competence that was almost mythological. The Admiral switched off the datapad. She turned back to Sharma, who had been patiently waiting, as if this entire revelation had nothing to do with her. And then, Admiral Eva Rostova, commander of the 3rd Battle Group, a living legend in her own right, did something that no one in that hangar had ever seen before. She drew herself up to her full height, her back ramrod straight, and executed a perfect, razor-sharp salute. It was not the casual salute an officer gives an enlisted person. It was a salute of profound, unequivocal respect. A salute between equals. Specialist Sharma, the Admiral said, her voice ringing with authority. Your work here is done. My compliments on your improvisations. Please report to the bridge. We need to debrief. Sharma simply nodded. Understood, Admiral. As she walked towards the elevator, the entire contingent of cadets, without any order being given, snapped to attention and rendered their own salutes. Their hands were trembling, but their eyes shone with a newfound understanding of what true strength looked like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't arrogant. It was quiet. It was professional, and it had just saved all their lives. The story of what happened in Hangar Bay 4 of the UNS Legacy spread through the ship, not like wildfire, but like a change in atmospheric pressure. It was a subtle shift that everyone felt simultaneously. It wasn't loud gossip shouted across the mess hall, but a series of quiet, reverent conversations in engine rooms, in barracks, and on the flight deck. The details were passed in hushed tones, each retelling adding another layer to the growing legend of the quiet shipwright who had stared down a plasma storm. The event was given a name. The Chimera's weld, the spot on the deck where Sharma had been working, with its flawless, almost invisible seam, became an unofficial landmark. Crew members would walk by and touch it, as if to draw some of her impossible calm and competence into themselves. The scorch marks on the floor near the Gamma 7 service hatch were not cleaned. They were preserved under a transparent laminate, a permanent reminder of the day the ship almost died. For Lieutenant Thorn, the aftermath was a crucible. He was not formally disciplined by the Admiral, a fact which was, in itself, the most severe punishment she could have devised. She didn't strip him of his rank or throw him in the brig. She left him in his position, forcing him to face the crew every single day, to see the consequences of his arrogance reflected in their eyes. The cadets no longer looked at him with admiration. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and disappointment. His authority was gone, not taken from him, but surrendered. He had to earn it back, inch by painful inch. A week after the incident, he approached Sharma while she was recalibrating a cargo bay's magnetic clamps. He stood before her, no cadets, no audience, just the two of them in the quiet hum of the massive bay. He didn't salute. He simply bowed his head. "Petty Officer Sharma," he began, his voice quiet and hoarse. "There are no words to properly apologize for my actions. My behavior was inexcusable. It was a failure of character, a failure of leadership, and a failure of basic human decency. I was wrong." Sharma continued her work, her hands moving with their typical, steady grace. She adjusted a power conduit, her focus absolute. Thorn waited, prepared for her to ignore him, to walk away. He deserved it. After a long moment, she paused and looked at him. Her eyes were not angry, nor were they forgiving. They were analytical. "Assumptions are a liability, Lieutenant," she said. "You assumed my coveralls define my competence. You assumed your rank defined your worth." Both were flawed data points. Thorn nodded, accepting the critique. "Yes, I understand that now. I would like if you would be willing. I would like to learn. Not what you do. I could never do what you do. But how you think, how you remain calm, how you see the solution instead of the problem." Sharma considered his request for a moment. Then she handed him a hydro spanner. "The pressure alignment on this clamp is off by 0.02 microns. The diagnostic says it's within tolerance. It's not. It's a failure waiting to happen. Fix it." And that was how it began. Lieutenant Thorn became Sharma's unofficial and often clumsy apprentice. He learned to see the ship not as a commander, but as a craftsman. He learned to listen to the sounds of the engines, to feel the vibrations in the deck, to understand that a starship was not just a machine, but a living thing. He learned humility not from a textbook, but from the quiet, unwavering example of the woman he had tried to break. Sharma, for her part, remained unchanged. She deflected any praise with a simple nod or a turn back to her work. She never spoke of the incident in Gamma 7. She didn't need to. Her actions had spoken with a clarity and permanence that words could never achieve. The legend was not hers. It belonged to the crew, to the ship. It was a story they told themselves to remember, that heroes were not always the ones with the decorated uniforms and the loud voices. Sometimes they were the ones with the grease-stained coveralls and the steady hands, the quiet professionals who held the universe together with a perfect weld. The legend of the Chimera's weld became woven into the very fabric of the UNS legacy. The ship itself seemed to absorb the story, its bulkheads and corridors echoing with the tale of quiet competence. The piece of warped metal from the Gamma 7 bulkhead, the section Sharma had cut through with her torch, was eventually removed during repairs. It was not discarded. By order of the Admiral herself, it was mounted on the wall of the officer's mess, a twisted, blackened piece of sculpture. Beneath it, a simple brass plaque was affixed. It did not mention Sharma's name. It did not mention Lieutenant Thorn. It said only, "Assumptions are a liability." It became a teaching tool, a focal point for lessons on leadership and respect. New ensigns, fresh from the academy and full of the same arrogant certainty that had once defined Thorn, would be brought before the plaque and told the story. They learned that the most valuable members of their crew might not be the ones who saluted the sharpest or spoke the loudest, but the ones who did their jobs with a quiet, relentless excellence. Lieutenant Thorn's transformation was profound. The humility that was forced upon him became a genuine part of his character. He stopped seeing the crew as a hierarchy of ranks and started seeing them as a team of specialists. He would spend his off-duty hours in the engine room, listening to the technicians. He would shadow the pilots during their pre-flight checks. He learned the names and functions of 1,000 different components. And more importantly, he learned the names of the people who maintained them. His own cadets, who had witnessed his downfall, now witnessed his rebirth. They saw him treat every crew member, from the cooks in the galley to the senior bridge officers, with the same level of professional respect. He was no longer trying to perform leadership. He was embodying it. Sharma herself was eventually reassigned, disappearing back into the classified shadows of the Aegis Division as quietly as she had appeared. She left no forwarding address, no personal effects, only the memory of her impossible calm and the perfect weld on the hangar bay floor. But her philosophy remained. She had planted a seed of quiet competence that grew and spread throughout the legacy. Crew members took more pride in their work, focusing on mastery of their craft rather than the pursuit of recognition. The ship ran better. Its systems were more efficient, its crew more cohesive. They were united by a shared, unspoken understanding, a culture of mutual respect born from a moment of crisis. On the one-year anniversary of the incident, Admiral Rostova held a ship-wide assembly in Hangar Bay 4. She stood before the entire crew with a now-promoted Lieutenant Commander Thorn by her side. She spoke of courage, of duty, and of the nature of true strength. She never mentioned Sharma by name, referring to her only as a certain petty officer. A ship is more than its armor and its weapons, the Admiral said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. A ship is a legacy. It is a collection of skills, a repository of knowledge, a testament to the quiet, daily acts of excellence performed by its crew. The strongest hull is not forged in a star foundry. It is forged in the respect that each of you shows to one another. Never assume you know the measure of the person standing next to you. Judge them not by the rank on their collar, but by the quality of their work, the steadiness of their hands, and the calm in their heart. As she finished, Thorn stepped forward. He looked at the faces of the crew, and for the first time, he saw not subordinates, but partners. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and strong, stripped of all its former arrogance. He told them the story. He told them of his shame, his fear, and his ignorance. He did not spare himself. He laid his failure bare for all to see, not as an act of self-flagellation, but as a lesson. A lesson he had learned in the heat and the fire. A lesson in respect that had been taught to him by a quiet, unassuming shipwright who had saved them all. Years passed. The UNS Legacy, now a veteran vessel with a storied history, continued to patrol the dark frontiers of space. Its reputation preceded it. It was known not for its firepower or its speed, but for the unparalleled professionalism of its crew. It was a ship where things simply didn't break, where crises were handled with a calm efficiency that baffled other commanders. The legend of the Chimera's Weld was now institutional folklore, the first story told to every new recruit who came aboard. It was their Genesis myth, the foundation of their culture. The scorch marks under the laminate were still there. The plaque in the officer's mess still gleamed. They were sacred relics. Captain Marcus Thorne stood on the bridge of the Legacy, a position he had earned not through ambition, but through a deep and abiding wisdom. The arrogant, insecure lieutenant was a ghost, a memory of a man he no longer was. He commanded his ship with a quiet confidence, his default assumption being that every person under his command was a hidden genius at their post. He fostered an environment where competence was the only currency that mattered, and respect was given freely to all. He was looking out at the star-dusted blackness when his new executive officer, a young, sharp commander fresh from a staff position at Fleet Command, approached him. "Captain," she said, "I've been reviewing the old logs. I came across a classified incident from your time as a lieutenant, the one they call the Chimera's Weld. The official report is almost entirely redacted. I was wondering, is it true?" Thorne turned from the viewport, a sad, knowing smile on his face. He looked at the young officer, seeing a reflection of his former self in her eager, confident eyes. He knew this was a critical moment in her education, one that no academy could ever provide. He gestured for her to walk with him, leading her from the bridge down to the elevators and then to Hangar Bay 4. They stood before the sealed hatch to Gamma 7, and Thorne pointed to the floor. "See those scorch marks?" he asked. "That's where the impossible happened. And see that weld?" He pointed to the nearly invisible line on the deck plate. "That's the signature of the person who did it." He then told her the story, just as he had told it to countless others. He recounted every detail of his own arrogance, his foolishness, his utter failure in the face of a true professional. He explained how the quietest person on the ship had been, by far, the strongest, how her silence was not a sign of weakness, but of a confidence so profound it required no announcement. He told her how that quiet woman, with her simple tools and her absolute focus, had taught him everything he knew about leadership, respect, and the true meaning of duty. When he finished, the young commander was silent for a long time, her eyes fixed on the perfect weld. "So she was real," she finally whispered. "The Aegis Division, they are real," Thorne confirmed. "But that's not the point of the story. The point is that there is a specialist Sharma on every ship. There is a quiet, overlooked genius in every engine room, on every maintenance crew, in every galley. They're the people who keep the ship alive, who do the impossible every single day without praise or recognition. A good leader doesn't create those people. A good leader is simply wise enough to see them and humble enough to get out of their way when they go to work." He looked his exo in the eyes, his gaze steady and clear. "Your job, Commander, is not to be the loudest voice on the bridge. It is to be the best listener on the ship. Your worth will not be measured by the orders you give, but by the competence you empower." The true legacy of Anya Sharma was not in the medal she had earned or the classified missions she had completed. It was not in the stories that were told about her. Her true legacy was in the quiet, daily functioning of the UNS legacy. It was in the engineer who double-checked a power coupling, not because the regulations required it, but because it was the right way to do the job. It was in the pilot who ran an extra diagnostic on her navigation system, seeking the same perfection Sharma had demonstrated in her weld. It was in a young commander who now walked the corridors of the ship, not looking at the ranks on people's collars, but at the skill in their hands and the focus in their eyes. Legacy isn't a monument you build to yourself. It is a foundation you lay for others. It is the continuation of a standard, the propagation of a philosophy. Sharma's philosophy, that action is more eloquent than words, that competence is its own reward, and that respect is earned through the silent, perfect execution of one's duty, had become the ship's operating system. It ran in the background of every action, every decision, every moment of the vessel's life. The story of the Chimera's weld had transcended a single event. It had become a parable about the danger of assumptions. It taught that the surface of a thing is its least interesting part. A person in stained coveralls might be the most skilled operator in the fleet. A new lieutenant with a polished uniform might be the greatest liability. A simple plasma torch in the right hands could be more effective than a whole arsenal of advanced weaponry. It was a lesson in seeing beyond the superficial and valuing substance over style. Captain Thorne often stood alone in the hangar bay, his hand resting on the cool, smooth surface of the deck plate. He would remember the feeling of the cold metal of the shotgun, the sneer on his own face, the absolute, unshakable calm in Sharma's eyes. He remembered it not with shame, but with gratitude. That moment of his deepest failure had been the beginning of his true education. She had not only saved his ship, she had saved him from himself. She had given him a second chance, not with words of forgiveness, but with the silent, powerful example of her own character. The universe is a vast and dangerous place, full of chaos and violence. But it is also a place of order, of precision, of laws that can be understood and worked with. Anya Sharma understood those laws. She moved through the chaos with a quiet certainty, her actions a demonstration of a deeper order. She didn't fight the storm. She saw the patterns within it and used them to her advantage. She was a master of her craft, and her craft was reality itself. The greatest strength is not the power to command others, but the discipline to command oneself. The most profound authority is not granted by rank, but is earned through demonstrated competence. And the deepest respect is reserved not for those who demand it, but for those who, through their quiet, unwavering excellence, make demanding it entirely unnecessary. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent action defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.